Thank you, everyone, for coming out on a beautiful day. It's great to see Ream Library full on a topic that really warrants our attention and has not gotten the attention so far I think that it deserves in the United States. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors an array of campus lectures, discussions, conferences, and conversations to foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation, as well as initiatives that foster Jewish-Christian understanding and enhance our understanding of Catholicism from a global perspective. Today, I'm grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with two colleagues, Aditi Malik and Jeremy Jones, and with the Africana Studies program to sponsor a really outstanding panel, and I mean that will help us to understand one of the terrible conflicts plaguing the world today, the war in Sudan. I'm grateful to both of them for their intellectual leadership, without which we wouldn't be here together. Before Aditi introduces our three panelists, I'd also like to thank my colleagues in political science and international studies for their support and welcome the discussants. Thanks to all of you in the audience for coming out today. I look forward to learning a great deal. I think, Jeremy, you're going to say a little bit about Africana Studies, and then Aditi will introduce our panelists.
Yeah. Is it working? No? Yes? It is good. Okay. I'm Jeremy Jones. I teach in anthropology. I'm also a member of the International Studies faculty on campus, and I am currently the director of Africana Studies. Africana Studies is an old... Is it working?
Yeah, as long as you hold it closer.
I'll hold it closer. Is it close enough? It is an old program on campus, a long history of promoting knowledge and research about Africa and Africa's diaspora in the Americas, in Asia, and in Europe. And so we're really excited to co-sponsor this event. I won't say much more about it. I think it's better to let the panel go forward, but I'll pass it now to my colleague.
Right. Hi, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. So my name is Professor Malik. I'm a faculty member here in political science, also affiliated with Africana Studies. It really is an honor to host and have a conversation and elevate what has been happening in Sudan. A conflict that really hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves. This war has been ongoing since April 2023, so we are in the third year of the war now. It has been described as the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world, and due to the ways in which the world has changed, this means that it is the greatest humanitarian crisis in history. So we will be talking about the war itself, the developments that preceded it, but our hope for the conversation here today is also to shine a light on the promise of the Sudanese people and to think about where we might go from here. So with no further ado, let me introduce our panelists. We really are incredibly fortunate to have three leading experts on Sudan here at the college today with us. So we're joined by Professor Nisrin Elamin from the University of Toronto, Professor Mai Hassan from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Professor Sharath Srinivasan, who's joined us all the way from the UK from the University of Cambridge. I'll share a little bit about each of them and their work, and then we launch into a few questions. So I'll talk about the structure that we have laid out for the conversation. Professor Nisrin Elamin is an assistant professor of anthropology and African studies at the University of Toronto. She's currently writing a book tentatively entitled Stratified Enclosures, Land, Capital, and Empire Making in Central Sudan, which focuses on Saudi and Emirati land grabs and community resistance to land dispossession in the agricultural Gezira region of Central Sudan. In addition to scholarly articles, Professor Elamin has written articles and provided commentary on Sudan for Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN, NPR, CBC, The Washington Post, OK Africa, and Hammer and Hope. Professor Elamin is also a member of the Sudan Solidarity Collective, which has raised over $900,000 to support local emergency response rooms and unions coordinating relief efforts in the face of a largely absent international aid response. The collective has also been doing political education and organizing around more just Canadian immigration policies. And we're very honored to be able to spotlight the incredible work of the Sudan Solidarity Collective as part of today's conversation. So we will actually talk about the work of the collective and hear a little bit more about how you can support that effort. Professor Mai Hassan is an associate professor of political science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the faculty director of MIT Africa. Her first book, which I do have here with me, and a book from which I learned a lot myself, Regime Threats and State Solutions, Bureaucratic Loyalty and Embeddedness in Kenya, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. The book was selected as a Best Book of 2020 by Foreign Affairs. It won the American Political Science Association's 2021 Robert A. Dahl Award and was the recipient of the African Studies Association's 2021 Bethwell A. Ogud Award. Her ongoing research focuses on popular mobilization under autocratic repression, with a focus on Sudan under the 30-year Islamist regime of Omar al-Bashir. We will have a chance to talk about the Bashir regime. And she earned her political science PhD from Harvard University. We are also joined by Professor Sharath Srinivasan, who is the David and Elaine Potter Professor of International Politics in the Department of Politics and International Studies, Polis, and a fellow of King's College at the University of Cambridge. He's a scholar of contentious politics in Africa in global perspective, covering topics such as failed peace interventions in civil wars, as well as rethinking democratic politics in a digital age. He's the author of When Peace Kills Politics, International Intervention and Unending Wars in the Sudans, published in 2021 by Hearst Publishers and Oxford University Press. Another great book. Fun fact, Professor Srinivasan may or may not have been my mentor early on in my career. So it's a real distinct pleasure to welcome all of our panelists, but also to have this opportunity to reconnect with a mentor who was really instrumental when I was thinking about what I want to do with my life. Okay, so a little bit in terms of how we have structured the conversation for today. We have a series of questions that we're going to put to our panelists, but also have an opportunity for Q&A at the end from the audience. So the way things are going to run is Professor Jones will begin by posing a few questions to our panelists on the background to the current conflict. We cannot do justice, right, to all of the background within the time frame that we have here, but we do want to sort of talk about the events that got us here. After those initial questions, I'll ask each of our panelists a couple of questions on the 2018-2019 uprising that preceded the war, a popular people's protest, a non-violent movement, right, that a lot of us, I think, who study protest, who pay attention to protest movements, looked upon with a lot of hope. Next, Professor Jones will ask our panelists to speak to the post-uprising period and the costs of the present war, which, as I already said, is in its third year. And finally, I'll ask a few questions on recent developments and the path forward for Sudan and the region more broadly. We will then open it up for audience Q&A. My African politics students are here, of course, right? So you are very welcome to ask any questions, but we're very open to questions from across the audience here. So with all of that said, I'll hand things over to Professor Jones to get us started.
Thank you. It sounds much louder when she's speaking, but it's okay. Okay. So I'm going to start here with some basic history. So in August of 2024, The Economist released an issue with extensive coverage on the crisis in Sudan, arguing that the war is the world's problem. So we want to spend some time just diving into the origins of this crisis. Before we do, it'd be helpful for everybody here in the audience, I think, if we have a little bit of a longer term perspective, thinking about things that predate the current war. So we'll begin by asking, what is the historical context to make sense of the current conflict, helping us to make sense of it vis-a-vis other conflicts in the Sudan, including the Darfur conflict and the long war in South Sudan. And we'll open the floor to you. You have
Oh, yes, sorry.
You're already mic'd.
So hi, everyone. My name is Nisrin. I just wanted to start off by thanking both Dr. Malik, Dr. Jones, and Dr. Landy for inviting us here. It's actually really moving to see a room full of what I presume are non-Sudanese here, gathering here to learn more about Sudan. So thank you so much for being here. This question about history, I think, is really important, but it's hard to summarize in just a minute. So I'm going to read from my notes, because otherwise I'll go too long. I think it's really important to situate the war within a long history of state violence that really goes all the way back to the 19th century, but at the very least, I think we should start in the 1950s, right? So we were colonized by the British, and Britain's colonial parting gift to Sudan at independence in 1956 was an economy dependent on the extraction of cash crops like cotton and on the exploitation of farmers, and a political system which was constructed to serve the interests of a kind of central and northern Sudanese elite at the expense of the south and other peripheral regions, but also of a rural population at the center that kind of sustained this extractive, export-oriented economy before oil and gold were discovered, right? Some of the initial forms of resistance against the post-colonial state came, perhaps not a surprise, from tenant farmers who organized, among other things, to demand a greater share of profits as world cotton prices plummeted. So there was a strike that took place in central Sudan on a cotton scheme shortly after independence, and the state responded with extreme violence. Over 300 striking farmers were shot on the fields or suffocated in detention cells. And a year earlier, Sudan's first civil war had broken out between South Sudanese demanding political representation and regional autonomy and the central government, right, made up of northern and central Sudanese elites, who had essentially subsumed the South as a quasi-internal colony facilitated by British colonial policy. And this 1956 massacre that I just mentioned is linked to the Civil War because striking farmers were threatening existing capitalist labor relations that allowed ruling elites to extract maximum profits to fund its repressive campaign against Southern resistance. And I highlight this moment because it really demonstrates the ways that state violence in Sudan has long been shaped by the need to reproduce and maintain an extractive, violent, ethno-nationalist state that serves elite interests by any means necessary. And I think we can draw a straight line from the outbreak of the first civil war in Sudan, which over the decades and in its two phases killed over 2.5 million, mostly South Sudanese civilians, and the genocide in Darfur, which hopefully my co-panelists, who, by the way, I didn't mention this, I'm very honored to be on a panel with two people who I've learned a lot from, and I'm much junior too, so but hopefully they will talk about that. And I think we can draw a straight line from that to the current war that arrived in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, in April of 2023. In the same way that I think we can draw a straight line between the Nakba of 1948 to the genocidal violence that the Israeli state is currently unleashing in Gaza. I think history is not only context here, it's a necessary framework of analysis to really understand the roots of this violence in and beyond Sudan.
You want to say something?
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming and, sorry.
Also
Is that better? Yes. Thank you guys for hosting this panel. As Nisrin was saying, I too am honored to be amongst all four of you, but also in a room full of students and faculty and other community members who are really interested in learning about the war. I think Nisrin did a great job talking about the center-periphery relations in Sudan and how that's a huge element, not just of the current war, but all of Sudan's many historic wars and something that's shaped regime politics since independence in '56. Or even beforehand, even during colonization. Something I want to shift to are some of the more immediate precursors to the war. So the war, yes, broke out in 2023 between two different security forces within the Sudanese state. We have the Sudan Armed Forces, the traditional military, and we also have the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. this is a paramilitary guard that actually emerged out of the Janjaweed that committed the genocide in Western Sudan back in 2003. And so in thinking about how these two units came to be against each other, well, the Sudanese state was run by an Islamist regime for 30 years between 1989 and 2019, and at the head of it was Mai Hassan al-Bashir. And one of the things that he did, and he did brilliantly, was something called coup-proofing, where he tried to, he looked at the threat landscape around him, and he was like, oh, well, I came to power through a military coup. Sudan's other two long-serving dictators came to power through a military coup. And so in thinking about the threats to his rule, he tried to instigate strategies or tried to implement strategies that sought to prevent a military coup from arising. And one of the things that he did was he fractured or fragmented the security apparatus. He created multiple security agencies that offset each other, something that in the literature is called parallel institutions. So if a coup threat arises from one of them, there's another one that can counterweight it. And so the war in Darfur and many other wars in Sudanese history emerged not just were about center-periphery relations, but were also about how subsequent dictators could stay in power. And so one thing, again, just to reiterate, Bashir really endowed and strengthened multiple arms of the security apparatus, not just to fight these wars for him, but also as a way to prevent any one security agency from being able to overthrow him.
Thank you, and hopefully you can all hear me and my mic is on. First of all, I just want to echo my thanks to Aditi, to Jeremy, to Tom, to everyone here at Holy Cross for inviting me. I also feel really honored and I was really grateful for the opportunity to sit with my co-panelists, and coming from further afield, it was a real chance to spend some time in person with people who I follow and read and sometimes have been online with in various fora. This is a really wonderful show of concern and support and interest in Sudan, and I'm very much glad that you're all here. What I want to start by doing is picking up on this point around the way in which the state has been organized and what led to this war. And as has been said by Mai, Omar al-Bashir and the National Congress Party, which was originally the National Islamic Front, was in power for 30 years in Sudan. And so that was a very long period of dictatorship, but it wasn't the same throughout that 30 years. So one thing I want to characterize for you to think about this war as different from those that came before is to think about how war relates to the nature of the state and is in some senses a reflection on the nature of power and the way in which power is being reproduced. And so over that 30-year period of the Islamist regime under Bashir, you could characterize it very crudely as being three different decades. And that the first decade was a much more ideological decade, a Islamist project that was very sort of destructively transformational of the Sudanese society and social structures, but also was the basis for the prosecution of the long war, the war in southern Sudan that ended in 2005. This regime inherited it, but it was also a prosecution against the antithesis of an Arab Islamist state, namely African, Christian, and other spiritual practices in southern Sudan. And those who had allied with them, so including non-Arab Muslim groups in the center of the country, in the Nuba Mountains, etc. So in that first decade, as with many of Sudan's wars, it was wars in the periphery, distant from the center, but linked to the nature of the state and how it was reproducing its legitimacy and its power. In the second decade, so in the 2000s, I crudely would say that Sudan was trying to be a kind of petrodollar state. It had discovered oil was flowing, money was coming into the coffers of the center. And it sort of it dialed down the ideological project. There was a split. And the war in Darfur emerged as a new kind of war of peripheries. And I was living and working in Sudan in 2003, 2004, and Darfur was distant. It was distant from Khartoum, and the wars occurred still in the peripheries, but now in northern Sudan in a more pronounced way. And that was because the state was getting its legitimacy and its power really from reinforcing a kind of political economy around the center, what sometimes would be called the Hamdi Triangle, this geographic triangle in the center around Khartoum, where the economy would sort of thrive and flourish, and power would be reinforced by protecting that. With the separation of South Sudan, the secession of South Sudan in 2011, the oil money quickly dried up. And in the 2010s, the Sudanese state really faced a massive fiscal crisis. Its economy was really undermined. And it's in this decade that I think you see the transformation from first an ideological state, second a more kind of economic, kind of petro state seeking to modernize and protect its socioeconomic class, to what becomes really a security state in the 2010s. Because there's a deep anxiety of how to be coup-proofed in the 2010s, and the form that it takes is to formalize these ethnic militias that have often prosecuted the war in the peripheries, and to formalize one of them as part of the state security apparatus that becomes the RSF. And the reason why this matters is, in a sense, the sort of chickens come home to roost, because the RSF becomes a military and security actor in the center of the country. And what's distinct about this war is it's a war that also starts and engulfs the center of the country. It's not a war of the peripheries. And that really is what makes this war so distinct and significantly more destructive in some senses for the whole of the country than the wars from before.
Professor Elamin, I wonder if you might speak to non-Sudanese involvement in this war that might help us understand why it has gone on so long. What are the other interests in this war?
Thank you for that question. So as was just laid out, the current war between these two factions of a military regime that grabbed power in October of 2021, really were attempting to crush a revolution in 2018, 2019 that overthrew the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir after 30 years in power. And I think it's important to frame this war as a kind of internationalized counter-revolutionary war, right? The purpose being to make sure that there is no civilian rule, that we don't get to democracy. And I think part of the reason this war has gone on so long is because it served as a cover for intensified forms of resource extraction. These, of course, existed before the war, but the profit margins have actually increased significantly, around particular commodities that I'll talk about briefly. And so, just to put it very simply, both panelists have already talked about the two factions, but on one side of the war you have the Rapid Support Forces, formerly known as the Janjaweed, who were kind of formalized into an element of the military regime in 2013 after they committed the genocide in Darfur, led by General Hemeti and their allied militias, whose leaders control much of the livestock and the illicit gold trade in the country. Sudan is Africa's third largest producer of gold, and the UAE, as its main gold trading partner, is now providing critical military support to the Rapid Support Forces as it extracts Sudanese gold. 70 to 90% of this gold gets smuggled out of Sudan through Chad and Libya to the gold markets of the UAE, meaning Dubai, Abu Dhabi, etc., and sold to Russia and other countries. On the other side, you have the army, the Sudanese armed forces, and their allied Islamists, led by General Burhan, who control large sectors of Sudan's economy, by some estimates about 70% of it. Right? Over 200 companies in rubber, livestock, wheat, cement, real estate, gum arabic, pharmaceuticals, construction, etc. Some of which are in turn backed by Gulf financing. Egypt is currently providing critical support to the army, partly to protect its interests with regards to the Red Sea and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, right? The sort of Nile River basin and their interests in relation to the Nile waters. But also, of course, for Sisi, right, having a popular democracy in neighboring Sudan would not be great. And evidence also suggests now that Ukraine, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia have also supported the army at different points, for various strategic interests. Again, it's resources, but also access to the Red Sea. We have a fairly long coast along the Red Sea. While the UAE is the RSF's main backer, they are also, for instance, the Bank of Khartoum, which is the main bank currently operating, is majority UAE owned, and it's also the main financial conduit for the army. And then, there's an Emirati company that also owns one of Sudan's largest industrial mines in army-controlled territory. Similarly, Russia is also playing both sides. They've supplied their RSF with weapons, but they've also supplied the army in exchange for on both sides, gold and access to the Red Sea. And so just very briefly, I want to focus on 3 particular commodities because I think it tells a particular story of this war. My friend Mohammed Salah wrote an excellent book about gold in Sudan that you should read. And he recently showed me how to track the trade of gold and other key Sudanese commodities like gum arabic and livestock from my phone. He showed me an image of a simple Toyota truck, pickup truck, filled with 10 kilograms of gold, like sort of barrels or whatever, crossing from Darfur in Western Sudan into Libya, destined for the UAE. 83% of Sudan's gold is mined artisanally, and its production is usually not captured through official statistics. We know that over 90% of it ends up in the UAE. The rest of it goes to Cairo and Istanbul. And people generally know this in relation to the RSF, but what they don't know so much is that the army is also increasingly smuggling gold out of Sudan through Egypt to the gold markets of the UAE in order to sustain its war effort, right? So I just wanted to mention, for example, that when a kilo of gold leaves Sudan, it costs the foreign buyer 10,000 USD, who then sells it at 65,000, right, which is a fairly large margin, but that's the official margin. The unofficial margin is actually much larger. Similarly, 1 unit of gum arabic, a commodity that's used in soft drinks and candy, Sudan produces about 80% of the world's gum arabic, is sold by the Sudanese trader for $120. By the time it arrives in the UAE, it becomes worth $5,000, right? The livestock trade has also boomed. The army and the RSF have both created safe corridors for livestock traders to move thousands of animals, often looted, across their territories to export terminals on the Red Sea and Egypt, while deliberately obstructing such corridors for humanitarian aid and people fleeing violence. And for Egypt in particular, it's allowing Sisi to kind of keep the price of meat low in a context where there's resentment against him, right? And so I say all this to say that it's these absurd profit margins, right, that have been produced in part by this war that tells us partly why it's continuing. As long as the war is profitable for some people, it's going to continue. And until those kind of flows of weapons and profit margins, until that kind of gets shut down, the war will likely continue. Yeah.
Right. Thank you all for that really critical, important, quick, but hopefully informative background to what we are seeing. Moving beyond the war itself, I want to ask our panelists a couple of questions about the developments that preceded the current conflict. So I'll start with Professor Hassan. I think it would be informative for our audience to learn about a really important critical juncture, right? The 2018-2019 Sudanese uprising. This has been mentioned, but I'd like us to dive into this a little bit more. Could you tell us about the uprising, what made it significant? Why did citizens rise up against this 30-year dictatorship in 2018-2019? So could you speak a little bit both to the motivating grievances, but also help us understand the timing, right, of the uprising? Why did we see it when we did?
Thanks for that question. In thinking about the 2018-2019 uprising, this was the uprising that brought hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets and eventually overthrew Omar al-Bashir, the dictator the Islamist who had been in power for 30 years. And I remember one of my panelists was, I can't remember which one of you it was, dividing up the decades. Oh, yes. Dividing up the decades and thinking about what Sudan's economy was like from the first 10 years of Omar al-Bashir's rule, the second 10 years, the more petro state, versus the third state after, the third decade after South had ceded and oil was gone. And so I think that's really important to understand the context of this uprising. So between 1998 and 2011, Sudan was booming. At some point, exporting more than 300,000 barrels of oil a day, making it in the top 10 or 15 oil exporting countries in the world. There was a lot of money to be had. There were subsidies for wheat, for electricity, for sugar. It was just, money was flowing, and yes, everyone despised the regime, but the urban middle class in many cities across the regime's base was actually quite happy. They were quite content based off of their material situation. But then that tap stopped once the South seceded. South Sudan is home to about 75% of joint Sudan's oil reserves. And so when South Sudan seceded, obviously, the tap for the North was greatly turned off. And that meant a huge reduction in the amount of money that the regime had to spend on everything. But while they did curtail a bit the spending on the security sector, they didn't curtail it as much as they did on the population. Inflation really skyrocketed during that period. Here in the US, we're talking about 3% inflation. Everyone's like, oh my gosh. In Sudan, inflation was 60, 70, 80% a year between 2011 and the uprising, to give you a sense of how precarious the situation was. And so at some point, it just got to be too much. I mean, there were prior smaller uprisings. There was a little bit of movement during the Arab Spring. There was a larger uprising in 2013, in which it was a sustained 3-week movement in urban Khartoum, where about 200 or 300 protesters ended up being shot. But then back in 2018 and 2019, we see a really sustained movement that started in December of 2018, lasting until April of 2019, that really brought out hundreds of thousands of people into the street. And what finally ousted al-Bashir is that the protesters, on the anniversary of Sudan's prior popular uprising against a military dictator in April in 1985. Well, it was going to be the 34th anniversary of it, and that's what got hundreds of thousands of people out onto the street. They went to the army headquarters and were asking the army to overthrow Bashir, and that's what they eventually did. And so I think it's really important to understand the historical context of what Sudan economically was like. And so thinking about all of this extraction that Nisrin has been talking about, Sudan clearly is a very rich country. It has the second most amount of livestock in the world, behind Australia. It's, yes, the third largest exporter of gold in Africa, but that's according to official statistics. Much of Sudan's gold is smuggled, and so if it were all actually recorded, much likely to be higher. Sudan still has oil. Again, 80% of the world's gum arabic comes from the country. And so the grievances that motivated the population back in 2019 is recognizing this wealth that's being funneled to the security sector, whereas the population are getting less and less.
Thank you for that really important context. So, Professor Elamin, if I could turn to you for the next few minutes. The 2018-2019 uprising was a period of regime-ending protests. And I'm wondering if you could help us dive into the Bashir regime a little bit. So what were its key features? How was he able to hold on to power for as long as he did? We learned a little bit about coup-proofing. But I'm wondering if you could also speak to who patronage was being doled out to, right, to sustain the regime for 30 years.
Yes, I actually think that you did a great job of sort of explaining, especially the sort of different phases of the Bashir regime. And what I'd like to do is maybe focus just on two key features that impacted the rural kind of parts of Sudan, in part because 60 to 80% of the population still relies on agriculture to kind of make a living, and we tend to not focus too much on the rural, I would say. So it was an incredibly brutal regime that, like its predecessors, military dictators before it, used state violence to facilitate land dispossession, mass displacement, resource extraction, particularly in the peripheries, where people were already marginalized, neglected by the state in terms of services and development allocations, and also vastly underrepresented in terms of political and economic power. And so I want to focus on that kind of second phase that my co-panelist was talking about. There was a period in the sort of 2000s, the early 2000s, where the regime really sort of accelerated a process of neoliberal privatization. And these policies, these privatization policies, had an incredibly harmful impact on the rural sector. And so, you know, the Bashir regime started implementing privatization policies to facilitate new opportunities for corporate agribusiness investments. Under the umbrella of something called tamkeen, or empowerment, the regime essentially purged its rivals from government, civil society, and the economy, replacing them with ruling party, National Congress Party loyalists, right? And they confiscated fertile farmlands and expanded the military's control over Sudan's economy through a kind of system of governance by patronage, if you will. So there were vast areas of land that were handed over to military elites and businessmen loyal to the National Islamic Front, later known as the National Congress Party, to establish, for example, mechanized farming schemes. The regime also established a technical committee for the disposal of public enterprises, with the aim of privatizing over 100 state-owned enterprises to kind of strengthen the political and economic power of these ruling elites. And among these enterprises targeted for privatization was something called the Jazeera Agricultural Scheme, which at some point was the largest centrally managed state-run agricultural project in the world. The British established it to extract cotton, right? Which before the war sustained the lives of around 5 million people in central Sudan, just south of Khartoum, in a kind of delta between the White and the Blue Nile. And the Bashir regime implemented a law which accelerated the process of privatizing the scheme by dissolving its central management and transferring the responsibility of water management, meaning the cleaning of hundreds of canals, to farmers, right? They withdrew state extension services, essential inputs like loans, seeds, fertilizers, tractors, etc. All publicly owned assets of the scheme, including machinery, harvesters, railway, research centers, were sold to private investors. And the staff of the Jazeera board, comprised of engineers, researchers, inspectors, was reduced from 7,000 to just 74 within a year. And the same happened with the railroad sector. And this, of course, plunged farmers into debt, 500,000 workers deeper into poverty. It also mobilized farmers and workers who got organized to challenge the regime's policies, and through organizing managed to hold on to their land. But of course, that organizing was then brutally suppressed by the regime. And we just heard about the kind of expanding security state, right? An apparatus of law enforcement bodies, paramilitary forces like the RSF, torture houses, prisons, surveillance tactics. And the violence of this expanding security state, though, also required buy-in from ordinary people. And thousands of people were absorbed into the security state as the regime's foot soldiers. And I'll give you two examples. Darfurians recruited as frontline soldiers to fight against South Sudanese resistance fighters through the Popular Defense Forces, which was one of the primary instruments of the Islamist kind of political and popular mobilization, and also dispossessed farmers and herders in central Sudan who were absorbed into the lower ranks of the security state, known for its kind of violent crackdowns on protesters, etc., are just two examples of how ordinary Sudanese, many themselves neglected and marginalized by the state, became kind of agents of its repressive counterinsurgency. And we see this in this current war, right? The vast majority of people being recruited into the RSF are people who themselves have been dispossessed of their land as herders, sometimes as farmers, etc. And so, you know, the army and the RSF are currently Sudan's largest employers. So we have to start linking land dispossession and sort of people being dispossessed of their livelihood to the expansion of a security state, people getting recruited as kind of foot soldiers for genocides, essentially, right?
Thank you, Professor Elamin. So staying with the uprising for just a few more minutes, Professor Srinivasan, I was wondering if you could speak with us a little bit about who were the main participants in the uprising, how widespread were the protests, and how were people coordinating, right, turnout, demonstrations during this time?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. We've heard a lot about the pressure that was building up for the population with an economy in free fall, and the increased securitized nature of the state, right? So the concerns and the grievances were widespread, but some of the questions that many of us ask is like, why 2018, 2019, why then, and how was it possible? Because I think most academics and commentators would say it was actually quite remarkable that this happened, and it happened and succeeded in overthrowing Omar al-Bashir. Some of the most thoughtful scholars working on the history of Sudan's uprisings, and it's important to remember there were 2 intifadas in Sudan that overthrew the ruler of the day in 64 and 85, but no one thought this was possible because of the way in which the regime under Bashir had really decimated and reduced ability of social organizations, unions, the civic space, opposition. This was all systematically damaged under 30 years of rule. And so this uprising occurred, and it was very widespread. I think what was really remarkable was how it it didn't just start in the center in Khartoum. Some of the earliest protests were in northern Sudan, the places which is considered the real beginning of the uprising in December 2018 was in Atbara, which is in the north. But it spread to capitals and towns, and obviously to the capital of Khartoum, but to cities and towns across the country. And what was interesting about it was a real amalgamation of many different forces. So unions, Sudanese Professional Association, the political parties that were mobilizing, but also students, and then especially youth and especially women who were mobilizing more, in a sense, spontaneously. And one can look into how that happened and how that was possible, but it was really, really widespread. So those hundreds of thousands that Mai spoke about was quite a remarkable thing to have happened in the context and conditions in which that occurred. But I guess what I want to highlight about that is that there was common cause in the uprising across this rural, urban, political, civic, set of different actors and groups, and it came together around this common cause of ousting Omar al-Bashir and overthrowing the regime. But like with all revolutions, of course, that common cause doesn't hold or bind an uprising in the period afterwards. So there are multiple different interests and priorities that come in the period afterwards, and that's what we also came to see in the aftermath of the uprising. But I think for that period, and it really came together in this unified group that was called the Forces for Freedom and Change, that really took the uprising sort of a moment forward into the future and pulled together a charter around the agenda for that change. It was a really remarkable and truly historic event, obviously very tragic in terms of how it didn't lead to change beyond that particular moment.
Maybe we can, in the interest of time, maybe we can push ahead and talk about that a bit. What did come after the uprising? What was the post-revolution transition supposed to look like, and why did it fail?
Okay, so this is another question for me, and I'll try and be brief. But so we have this historic moment, right? 30 years of this dictatorship, and the people have risen up remarkably and overthrown Bashir. But the first thing to know was that this wasn't just a popular revolution. It was a revolution, but it was also a palace coup. It was a revolution and a counter-revolution in the same breath. So in the sense that the people's uprising did lead to the fall of Omar al-Bashir, but he was also pushed out of office by members of the military and security elites that were part of his regime, and the RSF and the SAF being central in that. So they saw that he was a lame duck, and they sought to protect their interests. And the first thing that happened in the wake of the revolution that led to Bashir's deposal was that they took control in what was a transitional military council. And so the revolutionaries, the people on the street, the activists, stayed on the street. They were fighting. This is not what we wanted. We wanted to transition to civilian government. We wanted to dismantle this regime. And And the Transitional Military Council was in power, but it was not very legitimate, but it cracked down on these protesters. And there were some brutal crackdowns on the protesters who had were part of a sit-in, and Mai was there as well, part of a sit-in outside of the army barracks, saying, no, the army should get out of politics. We want to transition to a civilian regime. So the revolution was not fully won. There was a palace coup. And at that moment, a range of actors, including international foreign actors, who was trying to see a way out, brokered and supported a deal between the civilian leadership of the Forces for Freedom and Change and these military actors. And they created a constitutional declaration that would usher in a transition over 3 years to full democratic civilian governance. And so this was first not a full revolution, it was partly a palace coup, but it also wasn't a full revolution, it became a transition. And for me at least, there's a very big distinction between the popular revolution and the transition that followed. And the transition ultimately, this 3-year transition of a military civilian government to full democratic rule ultimately failed. And it failed, for me, it failed when there was the coup in October 2021. And that was when this same military actors and security actors, plus some others, took power from the civilians and really scuppered the transition. And so for me, in my own work, the transition to democracy that was promised after this revolution, why did it fail? Because it really adopted the same playbook as peacemaking in Sudan, which had multiply failed to end civil wars in the past. And what it does, it takes that political moment and it says, no, first we'll strike an elite deal between these different actors to just, in effect, calm things down. And the first thing that did was legitimate the military security actors who had cracked down on the revolution, made them part of the solution when they were there as the problem in the eyes of the activists. The second thing it does is it focuses on a transition that's a sort of templated idea of institutional reform and change in the state. And that brings in a whole kind of technocratic apparatus to sort of lead a country through a process of change. But that depoliticizes the whole set of issues. And in the case of Sudan in the transition, it meant that you had these very damaging developments like the IMF and the World Bank getting involved to reduce Sudan's debt burden, but demanding austerity. So you have a 30-year dictatorship and the people have taken to the streets and the hardship has led to this revolution. And yet the thing that the international actors required in the wake of this revolution was austerity measures to transform the economy. So a whole range of things that happen in the context of a transition which undermine the kind of moment of sort of civilian power, I suppose. And the third is democratic elections as the sort of panacea for postponing politics to a time in the future when civilian politics will get to have its day. And that really, again, undermined the sort of the spirit and purpose of the revolution. I think alongside that, it was a really difficult time. I think the tragic thing in Sudan is that the revolution and the aftermath also happened during COVID-19, and which there was a much less engagement from the international community in really seeing this critical and precious moment through. There was also a peace agreement with armed actors that just made the elite game of power, again, about armed movements and really, again, constrained and limited the space for civil politics. And finally, it is also true that the civilian actors who were part of the Forces of Freedom and Change, who had the common enemy of deposing the dictator, were also riven with differences and didn't really come together cohesively around protecting the civilian element of the transition. So in the context of all of that, the transition failed and the revolution was put back and set back.
Thank you. Professor Elamin, I want to ask you about the costs of the war at present. I think Sudan has been deemed to be in a state of famine, and we hear the term genocide used to discuss the current situation as well. So I wonder if you might help us understand the social, political, economic, humanitarian toll of the conflict,
and how we might like to think about it, how we might categorize it. It's certainly a war. Can we understand it in other terms as well?
Yeah, and I'll try to be brief and just kind of follow up on what you were saying. I think one of the things that happened during the transition, when the transitional government formed and power was always sort of tilted towards the military side of the transitional government, if you will. But then the civilian side, I think, really also marginalized the more revolutionary elements of the revolution, which were these resistance committees that are these neighborhood-based kind of organizing bodies that formed really in the kind of mid-2000s around austerity measures, kind of protests against austerity measures around the time of the Arab Spring. And they were really sidelined, I think, during that transition, where civilian elites kind of turned outward, trying to sort of, appease the international kind of financial institutions rather than really listening to the demands coming from the street. And so I think that leads me to the first cost of this war, which is that, we'll talk later about the ways the resistance committees and the emergency response rooms that came out of them are really now at the forefront of relief efforts. But you really, I think, saw during that time how ordinary people in Sudan at the neighborhood level and beyond were getting organized in a way to run an entire country in the absence of a civilian-led state, right? And that in and of itself, I think, should be very inspiring to all of us, if you think about it, right? Especially in the context of a war. And so I think one of the costs is that it really, undermined the revolution and the potential of these resistance committees who had put forth, you can read these online, revolutionary charters that really lay out what a popular democracy from the bottom up could look like. These documents are translated into English and they're quite powerful. And so where we're at now, I look at this war as a war against civilians. It's a war that has put 19 million children out of school. I think 1 million university students, out of school as well. Hunger and sexual violence has been used as a weapon of war. The RSF in particular has been using women and girls' bodies as strategies of war, and has put over 6.7 million people at risk of gender-based violence, including forced marriage, sexual slavery, etc. 13 million people are facing extreme levels of hunger in a country that could not only easily feed itself, but the entire region, right? And I think that, again, goes back to the history of the kind of decimation of the rural sector, but also the ways in which people have been prevented from farming, right? And the sort of, I study Saudi and Emirati land grabs. The Saudis and Emiratis have invested a combined $27 billion in Sudanese land, real estate, construction, ports, et cetera, over the last 2 decades. And part of their interest, right, is to make sure that the government that is in power, a military government, right, will maintain their interests. And so, there's currently, if I talk to my relatives who are still in Khartoum and the Jazeera, they haven't been able to make a living since April of 2023, as the majority of Sudanese have not. And they were already struggling before the war. Food prices are fluctuating such that in places like Al-Fashir, which is under complete siege by the RSF, people have been now for 600 days, people are literally being encircled and starved and attacked. Where you'll find a bag of lentils that costs an exorbitant price. And food aid has been prevented from coming in. There's currently cholera and dengue fever epidemics in various parts of the country, and people are having a really hard time accessing basic rehydration medications because the healthcare system has largely collapsed. My relatives haven't had running water or electricity since the war began, and are relying mostly on shared solar energy for kind of like basic charging. And I think in particular, right now, if we look at Al-Fashir, sometimes it's mind-boggling to me that we're witnessing really a genocide unfolding, and the international community has yet to fund the $4 billion response that the UN estimates is needed to launch a robust relief effort. I think they've only funded it by 26%. So how would we characterize this? I would characterize this as a counter-revolution, a war against civilians. I don't think the term proxy war is that appropriate because it leaves the Sudanese elites that are very implicated in this war and that are benefiting from this war off the hook. I think this is a partnership between Sudanese and foreign elites to maintain military rule, to legitimize it, and to continue extracting resources. So.
Thank you. Professor Hassan, I wonder if you might speak to the regional context of the war a bit, including neighboring countries.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And so the war, when it started, was between these two arms of the Sudanese state, SAF and the RSF. But now there are over 100 domestic groups that are involved in the fighting. 100 different actors, 100 different rebel groups, 100 different armed groups or armed militias. But that's not the extent of the fighting. Instead, all of Sudan's neighbors have been engulfed in this war as well, alongside other regional and international players. As I think Professor Elamin was saying earlier, both sides in the conflict have their Gulf backers. The SAF is largely supported by Egypt, largely supported by SAF. The RSF largely supported by the UAE. But those dynamics have affected how Sudan's other neighboring countries have been brought into the war. So for instance, the UAE has created client states, not just out of Sudan, out of the RSF and the western parts of the country that are under RSF control, but has invested a whole host of money and controls a lot of puppet governments across Haftar's Libya, which again borders Sudan, Chad. Some would even say Ethiopia and Kenya. And so because the RSF has such a strong hand to play, has a finger in all of these countries, other neighboring countries, particularly Egypt and also Eritrea, have sought to increase their backing of SAF so as to not allow the UAE to fully control this region. So while some international actors have joined the foray so as to protect their personal interests or to protect their country's interests, other times it's because they're thinking about the geopolitics of the region and are seeing what side their enemies are backing and then are forced to back the other side.
Thank you. Sorry, we have more questions than we have time, so we're kind of running through the questions real quick. I wonder, Professor Srinivasan, if you could speak to the civil resistance during the war and what sort of reaction we're seeing, if indeed it is a war against the people. What sort of response do we get from the people?
Yeah, so I mean, I appreciate for the audience, it's sort of, you're moving in different scales, but this is also just what is so confounding about the situation. The geopolitics and the regional politics that we've just heard about is hugely important now, and that's the tragedy of this war, is that war creates also these new kind of dynamics that entangle a range of different other actors, partly because they're concerned about the risk of someone else getting an advantage. So we've got this level going on, but we want to go back now with this question really to what happened to the revolution. And so Nisrin has talked about these neighborhood resistance committees, and they're a hugely important part of understanding what happened after the popular uprising and what's happening now during the war. And so I just want to get a bit of a sense of that, because if we just focus on the geopolitics, or we focus on the armed actors, or we focus on the horrible human suffering, we sometimes don't see how much work still goes on to mobilize, to find ways of mutual support, to express solidarity, and also to sort of keep alive the spirit and ideals of the revolution. So here we really need to focus on these resistance committees. And while they were around and in existence prior to the popular uprising, for me, it's really also worth thinking about the fact that after Bashir was deposed, these resistance committees really flourished and took root across the country. So what were they resisting? There's this revolution. What are they resisting? The first thing that they were resisting was this palace coup and the armed actors taking power and the fact that there was not a transition to civilian government, right? So they're resisting that as much as anything. The ancien regime is still in power. But I think the other thing that they were resisting was this transition, this sort of classic approach in which the elites get to strike a bargain, come into power, follow this process towards some future destination that no one has any trust in. So the resistance committees kept active throughout this period of the revolution, including after the coup that occurred in October 2021. And so for me at least, I find that it's important to distinguish the resistance committees and the revolution from the transition, because the resistance committees became the last line of defense of this popular revolution. And they continued throughout this time, and they took to the streets refusing negotiation, partnership, or legitimacy with the security state. And so those committees during that time, as Nisrin mentioned, they weren't just a negative resistance against the state or against this transition. They also started to talk about, think about, debate, discuss, and formulate visions of a popular democracy, of a political future of Sudan that would be different. And that's especially encompassed in these political charters that they came up with, in which there wasn't perfect agreement because they are very sort of decentralized, leaderless, they're very democratic. And that also is something that diplomats found really hard to deal with, but it's like, no, but this is democracy. They were vibrant, and they came up with alternative ideas of political futures. And that was a really important part of keeping the revolution alive, notwithstanding the fact that the transition was failing. But once the war broke out, obviously everything changed, and war changes everything. So for many members of resistance committees, they were fleeing. Many were obviously injured or even killed by the violence that ensued, were targeted by the violence by one side or another. And many also got caught in the ways in which the war pitted communities against communities, groups against groups. But alongside that, a lot more was still maintained. And what really shifted was the resistance committees being spaces of political discussion and talking about political futures to acting out that idea of what this political future should be. So returning back to these forms of solidarity, these forms of mutual aid that have been quite important in other periods, and helping people out, right? So one of the forms this took was the emergency response rooms that Nisrin has mentioned, which have been like a really crucial source of support and aid, but also guidance for people to sort of connect with family overseas or to escape conflict. There's been a lot of different roles that these ERRs, as they've called, have played. And I think one of the mistakes has been to treat them as humanitarian actors, but to misunderstand that they represent the same politics of the popular revolution. And they're trying to keep that politics alive. They're trying to show that solidarity by acting is a form of acting out the political future that we want. And so that's been hugely important. So for me, the transition is dead, and the counter-revolution itself has sort of died because the two counter-revolutionary actors fell out with each other, and that's why they're in this war. This is a war between the counter-revolutionary actors. But the revolution, despite everything, the popular revolution actually still lives in the form of the resistance committees and their work, even though that work has been severely sort of damaged by the war itself.
Thank you. I think that's really powerful. So we'd like to spend a few minutes just spotlighting the incredible work of the Sudan Solidarity Collective, which supports local emergency response rooms, ERRs, resistance committees, which we just talked about, and unions in Sudan. So Professor Elamin, could you talk to us briefly about these groups and their significance and potential as civilian actors in this moment?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, in April, when the war broke out, I was actually in Sudan with my family, and when we were sort of at the epicenter of the fighting because the RSF headquarters were very close to where we were in Khartoum North, and it was really these resistance committees that we talked about, and at the time I think there were about 8,000 across the country. Again, very, they each reflect the sort of social class and sort of character of the particular neighborhood that they're emerging out of, so you can't really necessarily characterize them as a homogenous sort of, set of groups, but because they're so connected to the neighborhood, they were the ones who showed us how to get out safely. And in fact, they evacuated a lot of the international diplomats, the NGO workers, etc. and immediately started, within hours of the war breaking out, doing kind of relief work, right? The elder who couldn't move, who couldn't evacuate, bringing that person water from the Nile because the water and electricity immediately shut off. And so really within days, they started to kind of formalize. They grew out of that network of the resistance committees. There's about 700 of them now across the country. And when I came back to Toronto, I met up with some Sudanese students on my campus, and we decided to form the Sudan Solidarity Collective. In part, because we felt like, well, what can we do at the moment? The best thing I think that we can do as a diaspora is to support the work of people on the ground and to also amplify their visions, not only as humanitarian actors, but also as political actors that should be taken seriously, which they have not. Throughout the transition, even today, when we talk about the sort of high-level peace deals, they're not taken seriously, right? And so these emergency response rooms, are run by young people like yourselves. I mean, people who should be, in college, who are running ad hoc emergency clinics, communal kitchens. They're, organizing learning activities for the, 19 million children that are out of school. They're helping people evacuate. They're treating people, deal with trauma after sexual violence. They're helping people deal with, the aftermath of that. I mean, it's really incredible the kind of work that they're doing while they themselves are under attack by both parties, right? And part of the reason I think they are being attacked by both parties is because they threaten the legitimacy of any type of military rule, whether it's coming from the RSF or the army, because they still represent, I think, a third way, right, a different way forward. And so, we have through fundraising, like grassroots fundraising, I've been traveling across North America to talk about Sudan, in part in order to fundraise. So I encourage you to go to sudansolidarity.com and consider becoming a donor. Most of our donor base are $10 a month donors, and we support these emergency response rooms, but also unions. I mentioned earlier the decimation of the rural sector. The Farmers Alliance in the Jazeera was very instrumental in making sure that the Jazeera scheme did not get bought up by foreign investors, right? And they launched recently a We Must Plant campaign after the RSF left the Jazeera, after basically massacring people in their villages and looting livestock, destroying a lot of the agricultural infrastructure. They're rebuilding. And they have this We Must Plant campaign whereby we sent them $40,000, and they've been able to supply 2,400 families with seeds and fertilizers to grow food in their own compounds, which has allowed them to become less dependent on food aid, right? And so I think there's also now agricultural response rooms in Darfur that are doing something very similar. And I think that is a model that needs to be invested in, right? To allow people to stay on their land and to grow food for themselves. They're now coordinating with emergency response rooms to basically bring some of the excess produce that they've produced into the cities as well through these, so that's essentially the work.
Thank you so much. So we are rounding things out. My last set of questions to all our panelists before we open up for Q&A. So we talked a little bit about how we should be thinking about the conflict. Professor Elamin noted that one way in which we could think about this is that this is a war against civilians, but I think it's also very clear that we are living in a time of many different conflicts, right? So I'd invite our panelists to speak a little bit about how we can situate Sudan in particular, right, during this time where we're seeing many different conflicts. And then I think it would be really helpful to hear a little bit about what sources of information do you go to, right? To keep up with what's happening in Sudan, given that this is a crisis that really hasn't gotten much attention, right, especially in the West. So where can one read up? What are credible sources that we can go to, right, to continue to keep up with what's going on? So I'll invite all of our panelists, just closing comments on those questions.
Thanks for that great question, Aditi. And so one of the ways that I think about this war in Sudan is that I think it's a representation of the new scramble for Africa. As we look to the world today and the changing world order, we see the US receding from the world stage. We see Europe very much focused on Europe itself. many of the powers, the Western powers that we saw as, promoting democracy around the world, putting down dictatorships, really trying to push many developing countries to hold elections, have really stopped that role. And within this power vacuum, we're really seeing a lot of more middle powers, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, really trying to go in on this stage and create like little turfdoms for themselves that elevate themselves geopolitically and elevate themselves regionally. We're seeing this a lot in part because as the West is receding, it's not really playing as much of a policing role, for instance, on the Red Sea, the critical Red Sea channels and sea lanes, boat lanes. And so given this recession, many of these countries in the Gulf, in the Middle East, have had to increase their geopolitical say and put out their capacity to better control this area for their own countries' geopolitical security interests moving forward. And so they're obviously the war in Sudan should be thought of about as a counter-revolutionary war, an awful humanitarian disaster. But I think it is useful to think about all of the other regional, international players that are going on and how this might be a model, not like a good model, but an example of how conflicts might continue, not just in the Horn of Africa, but across Africa more generally.
Yeah, so I agree. So some of you may have seen that there was an article in the Atlantic by Anne Applebaum in which the cover page, anyways, this is a war about nothing, and it's an indictment on the sort of the political zero-sum game that's going on between the armed actors. But I think it's absolutely not a war about nothing, right? So this is a war about everything. And I think one of the reasons it's a war about everything that we should pay attention to is what Mai said, which is it's about geopolitics and world politics as it's unfolding at the end of the dominance of a liberal international order and the dominance of sort of Western countries taking an interest in these parts of the world, in which middle powers are much more sort of jockeying for position, but also in a very particular part of the world, which is the Red Sea, Indian Ocean world, which is high stakes, very, very high stakes, because there's no dominant global power, and there's a lot of strong regional powers, and a huge amount goes on in this part of the world that really matters to sort of political futures. So that's one reason, really big, high-level reason. It's a war about everything, and it matters at the level of world politics. But the other reason I really want to emphasize much more than that, which I think for me is far more important, far more subtle, is that this is Sudan is about a kind of politics that we should all really care about. So I think we live in a time in which institutional forms of democracy, party politics, political representation, the usual ways in we think about what democratic politics is, or what how a good sort of state run is under deep threat. And one of the reasons they're under threat is because the idea of popular sovereignty, the idea of people taking an action and being involved in shaping their political future is increasingly very foreign to us. But what's happening in Sudan, what has happened in Sudan over the recent years, is that, right? In very adverse circumstances, it's people seeking to act locally within their political space to make a claim not just on the local situation, but on the future of their society, of their country, of their state. And so this is a form of politics which I think matters to political futures, not just in Sudan and not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but also well beyond. On the question of sources, really quickly, I say this to college students because I think I should. There is no substitute for finding good journalism, which increasingly is under threat. Journalists play a hugely important role in helping us make sense of the world. Good journalists do that very well, and bad journalists don't. But it seems easier and quicker to find information sort of through other kind of quicker, immediate forms, mediated in very complex ways. But I still think you need to look for good journalism. Like in the UK, it sounds weird, but actually very good journalism happens is in the Financial Times on world politics, and it's written very well and thoughtfully. I still go and look at other sources like The Guardian, etc. But in the UK, you have to look out for what journalism you want to read. But it's very important. But there's lots of really good journalism coming from the continent as well. And that's where I would also direct students to look at literally a magazine called The Continent, which is a really, really good source of thoughtful, I think, commentary and journalism on what's happening on the continent. I would direct you also to look there.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with everything that's been said. I think I was just thinking about this because Asada Shakur just died in Cuba, and was a former member of the Black Panther Party, Black Liberation Movement, and the Black Panther Party was seen as dangerous because of their free breakfast program, right? In part because they empowered people at the neighborhood level to kind of take control of their own communities, and I think the resistance committees are doing the same thing in a way that I think has the potential to cross borders. If you look at what's happening with the Gen Z protests in Kenya, for example, and elsewhere across the continent. And so I do think that we're looking at a time when, popular movements are seen as dangerous. And there needs to be, I think, more coordination between across sort of transnationally movements. So for example, at the University of Toronto, we recently voted to divest from all companies implicated in genocide, and discovered that the same companies in our pension plan portfolio that supplied weapons to Israel also supply weapons to the UAE, also supply weapons to the Rwandan Defense Forces that are implicated in what's happening in the Congo. And so those connections already exist at the corporate level, and I think we need to be making more of those connections in our movements, through our organizing. I think we're still too sort of siloed to some degree. I think at the corporate level, there's a corporate network of murderers, I would say, that are benefiting from people's deaths. So I think we need to make some of those connections. And I think also in terms of news and sources, there are some really great initiatives that have come out of the diaspora that is in the region. So for example, there's the Ayin Network, there's Atar Magazine. I often go to Radio Dabanga still, Sudan Tribune. But I think particular Ayin and Atar are really good sources. They also now do some analysis in English. Somebody I follow religiously is Muzan Al-Nil. She's a really great writer who I think is very focused on that kind of third way and the kind of resistance committees and their politics. And she's been calling, I think, for them to sort of think more about, right now the emergency response rooms are focused on putting out fires, that emergency mode, which of course takes you away from the maybe more slow-moving work of like political organizing and political visioning that does need to happen for us to kind of have some type of vision for how to get out of this or what happens after. And I think this brings me to my last point. One of the things I'm very worried about when I think about the wars, the genocides, the conflicts that are happening around the world is what happens when the guns are silenced, right? There is something called disaster capitalism. Who comes in and makes money to rebuild, and on what terms? If we look at the UAE's role, they're buying up ports across the Horn of Africa. They're buying up land across the Horn of Africa. Is it about food security? Yes, partly, but it's also about controlling circuits and networks of production and distribution across the region, right? And I think, people tend to sort of focus on the US empire as a kind of singular totalizing force, but there are these middle powers that are entangled with US imperialism that are doing their own harmful forms of empire making, if you will, and we need to pay attention to that. Even if they are dependent on US empire, even if they sometimes do, sort of the US's bidding in the Middle East, I think we need to pay attention to them as their own formations that need to be also challenged.
All right, wonderful. So that's the end of our formal questions for the panelists. I'd like everyone to join me in a round of applause for our esteemed guests.